me deeper than my feet could ever wander, and my faith will be made stronger in the presence of my Savior. Spirit, lead me where my trust is without borders. Let me walk upon the waters wherever you would call me. Take me deeper than my feet could ever wander, and my faith will be made stronger in the presence of my Savior. And I will call upon your name. Keep my eyes above the waves. When oceans rise, my soul will rest in your embrace. For I am yours, you are mine. Thank you, Will. Let's just pray for Will. Father, we're expecting to hear from you this morning through the voice of Will and from things that you're laying in his heart. We don't know whether you're going to speak to us as individuals or as a church, but Father, we anticipate you speaking to us because we know that your word is alive. We pray this. Ask you to bless us. In Jesus' name. Amen.
Well, good morning. As Jim said, my name's Will. I'm the pastor here at TCF, and it's really good to see you here this morning. If you have a Bible with you, please turn in it to Genesis chapter 41. We'll be reading from verses 37 to the end of the chapter. Genesis chapter 41, verses 37 to 57. We're continuing our series in the life of Joseph, sold into slavery from the land of Canaan, taken to Egypt, made a slave, wrongly thrown into prison, and now exalted to the right hand of Pharaoh. Genesis chapter 41, starting at verse 37. This proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find a man like this, in whom is the Spirit of God?" Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards the throne will I be greater than you." Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt." Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand and clothed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain about his neck. And he made him ride in his second chariot, and they called out before him, "Bow the knee." Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, and without your consent, no one shall lift up hand or foot in all the land of Egypt." And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphenath-Paneah, and he gave him in marriage Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On. So Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. During the 7 plentiful years, the earth produced abundantly, and he gathered up all the food of these 7 years which occurred in the land of Egypt and put the food in the cities. He put in every city the food from the fields around it. And Joseph stored up grain in great abundance, like the sand of the sea, until he ceased to measure it, for it could not be measured. Before the year of the famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph. Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, bore them to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for, he said, "God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house." The name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. The 7 years of plenty that occurred in the land of Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began to come, as Joseph had said. There was famine in all lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. When all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph. What he says to you, do." So when the famine had spread over all the land, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Moreover, all the earth came to Egypt to Joseph to buy grain because the famine was severe over all the earth. The grass withers, the flowers fall, but the word of the Lord stands. Now, if you're a believer here this morning, a question is inevitably going to come up in your life. And that question is this: is it really worth it? Is following God really worth it? Some suffering is going to come into your life. There's going to be some kind of hard teaching that you don't see the point of that is going to trouble you. Or the cost of holding on to belief in God will seem too high. You'll want to give up. It could just be years and years of grinding hardship, but there will be times where you will be tempted to turn away and give up and turn back. You know, throughout the scriptures, there are countless stories of people who came to the verge of giving up, for whom life was so difficult, for whom following God seemed so costly that they were almost tempted to be broken and to give up. And if anyone had reason to give up on following God, it was Joseph, wasn't it? You remember his story: rejected by his family, sold into slavery, wrongly accused, made a slave, left to rot in prison. You know, at any point in the story, Joseph could have thrown his hands up, cursed God, and given up. But he didn't do that, did he? He didn't do that. And here in this part of the story, we can see that eventually his trust in God paid off. And what you can see in this part of this chapter is a story of public vindication. What is essentially happening here is everyone is looking in on Joseph's life, even everyone's looking in on his endurance through suffering and saying, "You were right all along. The things that Joseph has said would come to pass have come to pass. He has been completely vindicated." And this story that I just read this morning is meant to be an encouragement to every believer who suffers and to every believer who's going through trials. This story is meant to help us endure as we look to our coming vindication. This story is meant to remind us that our endurance through hardship is not in vain. And there are three areas of vindication that I think you can see in this passage. The first is a vindication of Joseph's wisdom. His wisdom is vindicated. And the second is a vindication through we could call it fruitfulness and forgetfulness. That's the second thing. And the third thing is finally a vindication of God himself. A vindication of Joseph's wisdom, a vindication through his fruitfulness and his forgetfulness in affliction, and finally a vindication of God. Let's look at how Joseph's wisdom is vindicated in this passage, because the reaction of Pharaoh to Joseph's interpretation of his dreams is something that we've become kind of used to in this story. The interpretation of dreams is a major theme in the story of Joseph. So look at what Pharaoh says to Joseph in verse 38. "Can we find a man like this, in whom is the Spirit of God?" That's a rhetorical question, by the way. The answer is no. Pharaoh hasn't been able to find anyone in the whole of Egypt and in the corridors of power like this man Joseph. And like we said, dreams are a major part of the Joseph story. But as I've been reading through this, I think there's something funny about Pharaoh's dreams. Forgive me, but I don't think they're that difficult to interpret. You know, at the start of Joseph's story, if you read back, his dreams didn't need any interpreting at all. Joseph's whole family knew what they meant, and they were outraged at what his dreams meant. And I've been reading what scholars and researchers and interpreters have said about Egyptian dream interpreters, and it's clear that these guys were professionals. They knew what they were doing. They also knew how vital the Nile floods were for growing crops. They knew their land of Egypt was the breadbasket of the Middle East. And yet you're telling me that none of these men had the slightest clue what 7 good cows coming out of the River Nile meant, followed by 7 bad cows swallowing up those other good cows? You're going to tell me they had no idea? Listen, our children have just gone out for creche and Sunday school. I'm sure if you put this dream to them, even they would be able to interpret it in some way, shape, or form. They'd have a good chance of interpreting it rightly. But the reason I'm saying this is because I don't think Pharaoh's problem was that his interpreters and wise men didn't know the truth. I think his problem was that they were afraid to tell him the truth. And that made them fools. They didn't want to tell him the truth. But here's the important thing. Pharaoh has noticed that God's Spirit is in Joseph. Why? Why? Well, it was because Joseph was the only one with the courage to tell Pharaoh the unvarnished truth, even if it included bad news. You know, sometimes bad news is good news if you hear it early enough to do something about it. God's Spirit had made Joseph truthful. You know, didn't Joseph do the same thing with the prisoners in Potiphar's jail? He told them what the truth was, regardless of what the outcome would be for them or him. God's Spirit had made Joseph wise. And that meant that Joseph was courageously truthful. In comparison to everyone else that Pharaoh knew, Joseph spoke the truth. So what's the point here? Listen, the author of this passage is showing us that wisdom is not magic. Wisdom is not magic. Wisdom is concerned with courage. Wisdom is concerned with the truth of things. Isn't that the contrast that's being set up here? None of Pharaoh's magicians knew what to do because they were fools. Because wisdom is not magic. You don't just get zapped with wisdom. Knowing God makes you wise. Wisdom is concerned with integrity and honesty of character, not technique. All of the dream manuals of Egypt, all the technique in the world could not give them the courage to tell Pharaoh what he needed to hear, even if it was tough. See, wisdom concerns discernment, which means seeing things the way they really are, no matter how bad they look. You know, when Pharaoh asks if a person can be found in whom is the Spirit of God, what he's really asking is there anyone in my court with the honesty and integrity and the wisdom of Joseph's God? See, but God didn't just zap Joseph with wisdom. I think we can often read Joseph's story like that. We can think, wow, he was so gifted. God just zapped him with wisdom and he just had it. That's not true. Read the story again. Joseph's wisdom was cultivated by God through a life of suffering. See, growing in wisdom is not about a list of techniques that you need to learn, by the way. Growing in wisdom is not just about a bunch of stuff that you need to keep in your mind. We're so bad at this. We're so bad at this because our whole society is geared towards teaching us knowledge and techniques, but not wisdom. We fill the mind, but we don't form the heart. Just think about the internet for the moment. The internet is the most incredible source of knowledge in all of human history. You know, it can tell you how to change the oil in your car. It can give you all the information you want, if you look at Wikipedia, on how to run a nuclear reactor. But it cannot make you wise. It is the friend of information, but the enemy of wisdom. Listen, Pharaoh's court had all the information available to the world at that time. But there was no wise person to be found. Even the so-called wise men of Pharaoh's court were not wise at all. They were fools because they didn't know God. All the so-called wise people of our age are also, in the Bible's eyes, fools because they don't know the source of all wisdom. All the knowledge in the world at the time had not made Pharaoh's courtiers wise. They had knowledge, but not a knowledge of the truth. Because growing in wisdom and being vindicated in that is about knowing God through his Spirit. That is where wisdom is found. Because God is truth, isn't he? God is truth. Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And knowing the truth will not only set you free, it will make you a wise person. Even the pagan Pharaoh realizes that Joseph has access to a wisdom that he doesn't know anything about because God is the only source of ultimate wisdom. I mean, think about it. God is the only source of ultimate wisdom because he's the only person who knows all things. He's the only person who sees all things clearly. He knows beginning from the end. He created everything. Listen, if wisdom is about competence with regard to life's complexities, then God has to be the ultimate source of wisdom because he is the author of life. with all of its complexity. God created all things. So that's about wisdom. But what does this have to do with vindication then, you might be asking? Here it is. Those who believe in God and courageously live out the truth according to his design will be proven right in the end, because the belief of the Christian is the belief that is most consistent with reality as God has made it. You know, Joseph's vindication shows us that it is always the right and wise decision to tell the God's honest truth, no matter what it is going to cost you, and no matter what the risk is. I was talking to my father-in-law this week, who's a pastor over in Montana in the western part of the U.S., and he told me a story that really stuck with me. He knew a man that was a bridge builder. So his job was as a civil engineer, and he worked for a company that got government contracts in the USA. And his company got given a contract to build a bridge in Hawaii. Now, that probably would have been a lovely place to build a bridge because the weather's great. But there was a problem. The company had made promises that they couldn't keep. They were over-promising and underperforming. And actually, there was some embezzlement of money going on in that company as they were building the bridges. If you know anything about government contracts, you'll know that in America, they're incredibly, incredibly lucrative. And people fight tooth and nail to get these government contracts. So the CEO of this company had received the contract, and he was telling the project managers to just cut corners. Just scrimp on the materials or whatever you need to do, cut corners in order to get this bridge finished in time. And these project managers were saying, yep, that's fine, we'll do that. We just won't tell anyone. There's a kind of wall of silence about it. But this man, this one Christian project manager, said, no, I'm not going to do that because it is a lie. And lying, I believe, as a believer, is wrong. And do you know what the CEO did to that project manager who was a Christian? He fired him. He lost his job. He had to move back. It was really hard for him. But then eventually, the US government found out that corners were being cut. The truth outed. And that CEO was sent to prison. But that's not where the story ends. Because in prison, the CEO needed someone to run his company. And he couldn't trust anyone of his project managers because they had all joined him in that lie. And they too were culpable. So who did he call? He called the Christian project manager who had lost his job. And he called him and he asked him, listen, I'm going to be in prison for a long time, and I need someone to trust to run this company. Would you run the company for me? And the project manager, who was a Christian, said yes. Do you see a similarity to the life of Joseph in that person's life? They told the truth. They lost their job. They were as low as they could have been, but because they told the God's honest truth, they were exalted, and they were raised up again. They were vindicated. Listen, that's a very dramatic story of that. But in every believer's life, no matter how great or small, you deciding to live out the truth in your life will result in a similar kind of vindication, large and small. And we'll talk about how that vindication can come later on, but I just want you to grasp that in the first point here. It is always right and wise to speak the truth, because one day you will be vindicated. That's the first vindication you can see here. The wisdom of God is vindicated. But the second is a vindication through fruitfulness and forgetfulness. Because the middle part of this passage from verses 46 to 52 tells a story of 7 years of abundant fruitfulness. There's grain in the land of Egypt, as verse 9 tells us, in great abundance, like the sand of the sea, until Joseph ceased to measure it, because it could not be measured. But this public fruitfulness is mirrored in Joseph's personal life. Joseph's wife gives birth to 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, who would become 2 of the tribes of Israel. Now, whenever someone is named in the Old Testament, you've got to pay attention, because their parent usually names them a meaningful name that has to do with the circumstances of that person's birth. So what does Joseph name his sons here? Forgetful and fruitful, which is bad luck for the first son, by the way. Imagine if you name one of your children Forgetful. Hopefully that wouldn't be a prophecy. But he names the sons this for a reason, right? He says of the firstborn, God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. That is an amazing vindication. That's an amazing thing for Joseph to say. Just think back to the beginning of the story. Think about what Joseph's life has been like. Think about what his father's house was like, his home life. Joseph had a family that was riven by favoritism, hatred, heartbreak, violence. Joseph's father had played favorites, and his brothers had conspired to kill him and sold him into slavery. He was enslaved at the tender age of 17 years old. He was taken from his home. He was sent into a foreign land. He was falsely accused of a crime he didn't commit. He was sent to prison. Joseph's life up until this point had been one long, grinding misery. His father's house had been a place of deep heartache and pain, but God had caused him to forget it all. Listen, I don't know what your home life was like. I don't know whether you were from a home that was sheltered and good and loving, or I don't know whether you were from a home where you were abused or where you experienced things that marked you for life and that you're still working through. The grace of God is the thing that is able to make you forget those things and leave them behind. God can make you forget all your hardship and all of your past. That is the beauty of grace. God had caused Joseph to forget all of that, all of those tears. Because listen, it's not like Joseph forgot he was an Israelite, right? He named his sons Hebrew names. Joseph clearly remembered where he was from. And as we read on, we're going to see how Joseph still had dealings with his family. So it cannot mean that he completely forgot them. But the difference was where he was from, and his pain ceased to define him. All that had been done to him, all that he'd suffered took second place to God's grace. It was God's grace that defined him. You know, I think I've said it here before, but there is no earthly wound that heaven can't heal. There is no earthly condemnation that heaven's vindication cannot override. See, the goodness and grace of God had allowed Joseph to move on from his hardship. Have you ever met someone who's unable to move on from something that happened to them? They're unable to let it go. It's just hurt them so deeply that they just can't move past it. That's not what Joseph is experiencing here. Joseph, more than anyone here, has experienced deep pain and could have held on to it, but he hasn't. God's grace has allowed him to forget it. It no longer weighed him down. His chains, literally and figuratively, have fallen off. You know, throughout this story, Joseph had been forgotten by almost everyone, but now God has caused him to forget being forgotten. There's a wonderful irony there, and only the grace of God in your life can make that irony true. That's the beauty of grace. Okay, so what about the fruitful second son? You know, with the second son, Ephraim, Joseph goes further and says something even more radical. What does he say? God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. Not despite, not after, not apart from, in. God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. You see, Joseph is still in Egypt. He's not home yet. He hasn't met his family again. He hasn't had the chance to reconcile with them, which is coming. He's still in the land of his affliction, but he's producing fruit. He's being fruitful. By the way, God is going to do exactly the same thing for the nation of Israel when they're enslaved in Egypt. If you turn to Exodus chapter 1, you'll realize that that Israel is in the land of Egypt, suffering under slavery, and yet they are being fruitful and multiplying, which is the command that God gave to humankind in Genesis chapter 1 and 2. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And God is proving here through the story of Joseph that it's not just despite sufferings that he will make you fruitful, it's in sufferings that he will make you fruitful. Because for whatever reason, God delights in bringing beauty out of brokenness. Suffering is the manure out of which Christian fruitfulness grows. I don't know why it's that way, but it is that way. You know, God vindicates his people by causing them to be fruitful in the midst of trials. And that's, by the way, how this is different from the prosperity gospel. Because the prosperity gospel will tell you that once you become a believer, you're free from hardship and trial. That everything's going to go your way. The path is going to be straight and it's going to be filled with wonders. But this passage belies that. The true gospel tells you that once you become a believer, you are made fruitful in the midst of affliction. That is where wisdom is found. That is where truth is found. And how could it be any other way? Just read the Bible. It's the pattern of life for everyone who follows God. You don't even have to read the Bible. Just read a Christian missionary's biography. They are full of stories of people who have been made fruitful in the land of their affliction. Read Hudson Taylor. Read about John G. Patton. I was listening to a podcast this week, and there was another story that I came across. There was a Christian CEO of the UK's oldest private bank named Jeremy Marshall. And he was following God. He was living his faith out. He was doing his job quietly. He was looking forward to retirement, and then he discovered that he had an aggressive form of cancer. And he calls himself a walking medical disaster because years down the line, he's had 30 courses of chemotherapy. He's had 12 operations. He's lost sight in both of his eyes. But I was listening to his testimony, and his testimony was that through his suffering, incredible suffering, God had opened opportunities to share the gospel with other people that he could never have imagined was he healthy. You know, his trials gave him a powerful connection with others whose suffering nobody else could understand. The comfort that he had received from God, he was able to comfort others with who were going through the same thing. He says that parts of God's word came alive to him in ways that they hadn't before his illness. That the mercy and the beauty and the grace and the sovereignty of God became radiant and luminous in ways that they perhaps weren't before. And he even said a friend of his who was a staunch atheist called him one day and said, "Listen, I gave God a surprise today. I walked into a church and said a prayer for you." Do you see how God was making him fruitful in his affliction? Many of you here this morning will be going through afflictions, some of which are known to others and some of which are private to your own hearts. The truth that resounds through the word of God and the story of Joseph is that if you hold on to him and if you remain wise and truthful in your trials, God will make you fruitful in the midst of it. Because for the believer, no suffering is fruitless. No suffering is fruitless. How could it be? Jesus' suffering was terrible, but it wasn't fruitless. How can the servant expect to be any different from the master? We shouldn't be. You know, I could recount even more stories of how God makes suffering believers fruitful, but we run out of time here this morning, and we're already short on time. The truth is that suffering is often the soil for incredible fruitfulness, which will vindicate our faithfulness. God can make you fruitful and forgetful through suffering. But the final vindication here, the final vindication, is one you can only see if you can step back and look at Joseph's life as a whole. And it's a vindication, actually, of God himself. Let's look at that finally, because one of the great dangers of suffering is how lonely it can make us. Suffering is a profoundly isolating experience because what it does is it throws you back onto yourself. There's nothing that throws a man back onto his own soul like going through suffering and trials. And one of the problems, I think, with our culture nowadays is we're so individualistic that we only relate our suffering to ourselves. We can't step back and look and see how it's relating to the people around us and to the lives of others as a whole. You know, believers like Joseph have an understanding of how their lives fit into the mystery of God's plan. Many, many people that don't believe in God today have lost a sense of a greater purpose for their lives outside of their own narrow self-interest. So therefore, we don't have a way to meet suffering with a greater perspective, which is going to hold us fast. But time and again, the story of Joseph reminds us that our sufferings as God's people concern far more than just us. You know, I've talked in weeks past about a master narrative that is shot throughout the whole Bible. And the reason I'm doing this week after week is I want you to see it. I want you to see that the Bible is not just a set of isolated moral tales. It is one story being told across thousands of years about Jesus Christ, the Messiah. And let me try and show you where this master narrative is seen this morning. Because think about what you have in this story. You have a man, Joseph, in whom is God's Spirit, who is raised to rule with a delegated authority over the land of his master. That's the story of Adam. It's the story of Adam in Genesis chapter 1 and 2. Think about it. Just as Adam is dependent on God to know good from evil, so Joseph is dependent on God for his wisdom and discernment, to know the good years from the bad years. Just as Adam was meant to rule as God's representative, Joseph rules the land of Egypt as Pharaoh's representative. Just as God provided a wife for Adam in the garden and set him over all the land of Eden to enjoy, so Pharaoh provides a wife for Joseph and sets him over all of Egypt. Just like Adam, Joseph was fruitful and multiplied in his offspring. Do you see the pattern of the master story that is being woven here? You see, Joseph is a picture of what might have been had Adam obeyed God in the garden and trusted him for the good, even if he couldn't understand what was coming. The story of Joseph is also a promise of what might still come if God's people obey and trust him like Joseph does in the future. See, Joseph is trusting that no matter the confusion of his trials, God is working out his purposes through them, even as he ascends to a position of power and receives this incredible vindication. Because there's no escaping it, is it? Suffering is at the very heart of the story of the Bible. The story of the world that God is writing. Suffering was not God's original design for humanity, but he directs it for mysterious and wise purposes. Because Joseph isn't the fulfillment of this pattern that we've just realized, is he? Jesus is the fulfillment of this pattern. Jesus, who like Joseph, was raised to the right hand of power and used it to save the lives of countless people, gathering more redeemed into his kingdom than sand on the seashore, which, by the way, is part of the promise to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. It's all woven together. See, suffering is not the only way that Christ became like us and redeemed us, but is one of the main ways that we become like him and experience his redemption in our lives. We walk the same path as he walked. We become like him, knowing his sufferings, whether that's the loss of a family member, or whether that's chronic pain, or whether that's cancer, or whether that's loneliness or mental illness. When you walk the path of suffering as a believer, you are sharing mysteriously in his sufferings. Now, almost nobody, Joseph reminds us, grows into greatness. Almost nobody finds God without suffering, without pain coming into their lives, like smelling salts to wake them up to the facts about their life and their own hearts to which they were completely blind to begin with. This story is here to remind us that God will do what he has promised. No matter how difficult the path is, no matter how remote the fulfillment seems, God keeps his promises. Joseph has been ascended to power this week, and he is receiving at this moment in his life a reminder that God will be vindicated. The dreams that God gave Joseph will indeed come true. It's helpful to think about who the original audience of this book of Genesis was. Do you know? See, we believe that Moses wrote the book of Genesis, and he wrote it for the Israelites who were suffering on their way to the promised land. They'd been brought out of Egypt, they were suffering in the wilderness, and they hadn't reached the promised land yet. These stories were written down so that these Israelites could know not just that their trust in God would be vindicated, but that God would be vindicated when he brought them into the land just as he promised. Suffering does not nullify God's promise. It somehow mysteriously drives it along to its stated end. Joseph's ascension vindicates God. Why? Because it proves that God was right all along in giving him those dreams. But we have to be honest. Many of us won't see the kind of incredible vindication Joseph does in his lifetime. There's few of us in this room that will be raised to the right hand of power in our lifetimes. It's atypical. But let me extend it to what the New Testament says, because one day, my friends, one day we will. One day we will be vindicated. We are promised that just as Joseph was vindicated when he was raised to Pharaoh's right hand, just as Jesus was vindicated when he was raised from the prison of death to God's right hand, so will we. When we have stood the test of suffering in this world and remained faithful to Jesus, we will hear these incredible words from him. Well done, good and faithful servant, enter into the joy of your master. Isn't Joseph hearing that this morning? He's been a good and faithful servant. He's entering into the joy of his master Pharaoh. That's a pale picture of what believers are going to hear on that final day when they have stood the test of trials, when they have stood the test of telling the truth even when it hurts. They will hear from their Savior, welcome home, enter into the joy of your master. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. See, Joseph's vindication here is a picture of that greater future that God has promised for all who love him. If you this morning embrace that pattern beneath the sufferings of this world and this life, you will be vindicated in the end. You will. If you don't believe in God, all that vindication that you're looking for will come to nothing. It will come to nothing. But if you're a believer, all of the futility you're experiencing, all of the pain, all of the suffering, when you remain faithful, will be vindicated in the end. You will be proven right in the end, because nobody who trusts God is ever put to shame. You know, there were a lot of storms recently. One of the things that Liv and I love doing is going to the Fife Coast and walking the Fife Coastal Walk. But one of the things I love doing is seeing the sea crash against the rocks on the shore. And there are times where you get to see some incredible choppy seas. If you've ever been to the coast on a storm, you'll see the waves come and hit the rocks. And sometimes the waves are so large that they cover and engulf that rock. And you think, that is the end of that rock. How could it possibly stand up to that wave crashing over it? But then the waves recede, don't they? And the rock is still there. It hasn't budged an inch. See, a person who holds on to God through their trials is like that rock. No matter what is thrown at you, no matter how strong the wave that engulfs you is, no matter if you feel like it is over your head, it will not make you lose your footing. And at the end of the age, when the waves recede, you will still be standing, just as Joseph is still standing this morning. The waves had washed over Joseph, crashed over him most of his life, but in this passage they've receded, and by God's grace he was still standing. Do you know that kind of strength? If you don't this morning, can I urge you, put your trust in him. No one who puts their trust in God will be put to shame. Christian, if you are asleep in your faith this morning, wake up. Put your trust in him. Because you will stand firm in the day of trial. You will be vindicated in the end when God raises everyone bodily. You've ever wondered why God raises both the wicked and the righteous at the end of the age? It's so that everyone will see, every knee will bow, and every tongue will confess that Jesus was right at the end of it. And everyone who believed in him was right. Believer, this morning, be encouraged. That is the future to which you are heading. Because we will be vindicated in the end. Let's pray. Lord, it's hard for us to see this vindication because it's in the future. Help us to trust this morning that there is a vindication coming. Help us not to grow weary or lose heart. Help us to cling to your promises. Help us to faithfully serve you in the midst of affliction and to know that one day we will see you when you return. We put our trust in you this morning, Lord. Help us to go into this week and lay our lives down and walk into whatever suffering you've called us to walk into, knowing that Jesus has walked into it before us and will bring us through it to the other side. Lord, whatever waves are going to crash over us this week, help us to stand firm in our faith, knowing that the same sufferings are being experienced by believers across the world. We are not alone, and one day we will see you face to face. Thank you, Lord, in Jesus' name.